The coordinates were known. The target was clear. Yet 4 months, this one stone fortress swallowed Allied soldiers whole. How many good men must be fed into the mouth of the beast before we admit, this is not a target, this is a trap? Today, we peel back the layers of deception surrounding the Führer's most crucial Western command post general crawl esse impenetrable citadel and uncover the bloody history of the missions that failed to crack its code. We are looking at Crow's Nest. It wasn't just an offing. It was the nerve center, coordinating every German movement from the Rhine to the coast. Lose the citadel, and the Western Front collapses. Kroll knew this. He didn't build a bunker. He engineered a mountain of steel and rock designed specifically to digest ambition. Thick, reinforced concrete walls, 30 feet high. Observation posts carved into the sheer cliff face, giving them undisputed sight lines for miles. The entire valley floor below was a kill zone, pre-sighted for heavy mortar. Failed? Listen to the ghost. First, the 101st Airborne's reconnaissance squad vanished near the perimeter. Then, Operation Torchlighter, frontal armored assault, was reduced to scrap metal in under an hour. 300 men, 2 attempts, 0 gain. The message was brutal and absolute. Established units cannot touch this place. To even attempt capture again means signing a death warrant. The failure at Kroll's Nest had been absolute, a lesson carved in steel shrapnel and ghost stories whispered around cold campfires. The brass knew the doctrine had choked on its own strict instructions. Protocol demanded overwhelming force, synchronized maneuvers, and approved ordnance. Protocol ensured every attempt was perfectly traceable, perfectly accountable, and perfectly predictable. 300 lives disappeared because regulations insisted on a hammer when what they desperately needed was a scalpel, wielded by a hand outside the established order. This absolute devotion to the book was why General Kroll still slept soundly in his mountain, and why Private First Class Elias Vance was currently scrubbing rust off a decommissioned Haftra miles from the front lines and the scent of danger. Vance wasn't a hero in waiting. He was a problem neatly filed away. He was officially a grunt, though sometimes informally called corporal when someone needed him to take responsibility for shoddy work. His true trade was tunneling and explosive diagnostics, a field the Army officially reserved only for engineer captains or those with 4 years at West Point. Vance had 4 years of dirt under his fingernails and a habit of ignoring safety margin. He was technically attached to the now defunct 14th Support Regiment, a unit that existed only on paper now. The exclusion wasn't accidental. It was institutional rigor mortis. Only commissioned officers were permitted access to top-tier operational briefings regarding targets like the Citadel. Vance, the man who could smell a structural weakness in reinforced granite, couldn't even get past the barbed wire surrounding the planning tent. He knew with a sinking certainty that kept him awake at night that Operation Torchlight had driven straight into a blind alley the moment the plans were stamped. The irony was this: the regulations designed to maintain order ensured the deaths of men by strictly prohibiting the one man who might have saved them. Vance's file, deliberately misplaced 3 states away by a weary administrative clerk, specified his expertise only as general utility. This was the shield protecting the high command from Vance's dangerous competence. If they officially sanctioned his methods, which involved black market primers and reading geological survey maps like Portride, would violate at least 7 standing directives concerning operational integrity. It wasn't cross-mortar the generals feared most. It was the inevitable, scathing internal review. He was a wild card, and the military playbook has no section for wild cards. His lack of rank was his cage, a bureaucratic containment unit. Major General Sterling, the man now facing the impossible task of explaining 300 fatality, had been forced to rely exclusively on officers whose resumes read like lists of approved tactics. Those tactics failed to recognize that Kroll hadn't built a defense. He had built a labyrinth meant to mislead, and only a mind specialized in finding the unseen seams could unravel it. Vance was that mind. He'd spent his nights sketching the Citadel's likely deep foundation, predicting where the bedrock shifted and where the concrete was thinnest, working entirely without authorization. Asterisk, asterisk. He knew the precise location of the two non-structural air vents Kroll never intended anyone to find. Asterisk, asterisk. This self-assigned homework was technically punishable by insubordination charges, but Vance considered it insurance. He carried his only authorized toolless standard-issue shovel butt. Strapped beneath his jacket was a customized solenoid trigger, polished smooth from repeated handling, sourced from a pre-war German factory. This device, small and illegal, was essential for the kind of precise, silent detonation needed to compromise the Citadel's inner core. If he were caught with it, he'd face a stockade offense, because it didn't have the Army's required serialization stamp. He was a ghost within the system, relying on stolen maps and scrounged explosives, all because the official channels designated him as too junior, too unvetted, and crucially, too much of a liability to risk on a high-stakes, high-failure mission. The military required clean lines of authority and clear responsibility. Vance offered neither. He offered success, but at the cost of violating every rule, which, in the eyes of the Pentagon desk jockeys, was a far worse offense than dying valiantly in a textbook frontal assault. Asterisk, asterisk. The real reason for his deep freeze exclusion, however, went beyond paperwork. It was personal, tied to the vanishing of the 101st Airborne Reconnaissance Team 6 weeks prior. A failure Vance felt he could have prevented. Asterisk, asterisk. Sterling knew the clock was ticking down to the moment Hitler realized the Citadel was vulnerable. He had to break the rules, but publicly he couldn't. So, a captain, a tired man with ink on his collar and a terrible secret, was dispatched far across the rear lines. The order was delivered in a whisper, entirely verbal, entirely untraceable. "Bring me the grease trap, Corporal," the message implied, "and ensure his boots leave no official footprint." The corporal, sitting in the humid, stinking motor pool, finally looked up from his useless task. He didn't ask about the mission. He didn't ask about the casualty. He asked only one question, his voice low and scraped raw. "Do I get to choose the entry point?" The protocol was already dead. Only the Citadel remained. The whispered order faded, leaving Corporal Vance alone with the stench of diesel and the crushing weight of institutional betrayal. He wasn't just breaking protocol. He was signing away his future, trading stripes for potential rope. The mission had no designation, no paper trail, meaning if he succeeded, it would be someone else's glory, and if he failed, he'd simply vanish, another ghost swallowed by the fog of war. He slid the map across the filthy workbench, tracing the contours of the Citadel. The silence of the motor pool, usually comforting, now felt like the deafening roar before the firing squad. This was the first realization. The system had abandoned the 101st, and now it had abandoned him too. Vance dragged a grimy finger along the perimeter, stopping abruptly at the rumored sewage line, the grease trap he was implicitly ordered to utilize. Standard infiltration dictated an approach through the lightly guarded northern forest. Textbook maneuver for Valfa. But textbook for Valfa assumed the enemy didn't already have eyes on that forest, waiting for the expected move. The 101st didn't vanish because they were sloppy. They vanished because they walked into an ambush that followed the playbook too closely. Vance's duty wasn't to the rulebook. It was to the men still trapped. Those POWs, the brass insisted, were merely missing in action. He knew better. Thanks to a frayed radio intercept he hadn't dared log, the 101st were bargaining chips, not casualties. He pulled out a pack of stale cigarettes, the smoke tasting like regret and gunpowder. The risks weren't abstract. They were specific. Insubordination in a theater of war carried Clause 90 to death by firing squad, swift and absolute, unauthorized deep infiltration, coupled with ignoring specific entry orders. The initial grease trap instruction was clearly bait. A test of obedience magnified the charge. He was choosing the eastern ridge, a known minefield, but one that offered a blind spot the satellites couldn't track. This ridge, codenamed Judas Shoulder, was suicide, yet it offered the only chance of surprise. The real fear wasn't death on the battlefield, but the slow, clinical death of the military justice system, proving his necessity only after they had hanged him. Vance wasn't a captain or a major. He was a corporal, lowest on the operational totem pole, and that lack of rank was his shield and his heavy burden. He was disposable enough for the mission, but crucial enough to know the stakes. The weight of command, usually distributed across a general staff, rested entirely on his bruised shoulders. Every decision gear selection, timing, route was a life or death gamble with no committee to share the blame. He looked at the photo, tucked beneath the mappa grainy image of Sergeant Miller, the man who saved him at Mila was with the 101st. Vance wasn't just saving lives. He was repaying a blood debt, personalizing the entire war. The rationale hardened, crystallizing into a brutal, simple truth. Rules were designed for times of order, not for moments when the clock stopped ticking and the enemy held the highest cards. If he followed the textbook, the delay would ensure the 101st was moved, executed, or worse, used in some nefarious propaganda play before Sterling could mobilize official forces. Insubordination wasn't a choice of defiance. It was an act of triage. He was sacrificing his honor, his career, and likely his life to buy a single window of opportunity. What the Pentagon failed to understand was that the ultimate rule was survival, and the definition of necessary often looked exactly like treason. He began packing the essentials: silenced rifle, specialized climbing gear, and 3 days of rations. The inventory was a quiet act of rebellion. He didn't take the standard issue usually traced. Instead, he took a modified short-burst repeater, scavenged from a downed enemy aircraft, purely illegal technology. He was already so far past the line, a court-martial felt almost inevitable, regardless of success. Yet, the thought didn't paralyze him. It liberated him. He had nothing left to lose but the mission itself. He realized, with a chilling clarity, that the high command wasn't expecting him to succeed. They were expecting him to die quietly, clearing the political table. The grease trap plan, the official path, would have been clean, defensible, and utterly ineffective. It was the path of the good soldier, the compliant automaton. Vance rejected it, not out of arrogance, but out of grim necessity. He stared at his reflection in the oily puddle near his Butza face, too young for the weight of this decision, etched with the certainty of a man who had already died once. He had to accept the worst-case scenario: capture, trial, conviction. He had already mentally prepared the defense. I acted outside of protocol because protocol ensured failure. I accepted execution so they might live. He slipped the worn identification tags of his team into his pocket. A morbid talisman. The citadel loomed, a concrete spider waiting for its prey. He checked the time. 2 hours until the scheduled shift changed near Judas Shoulder. That was his window. The moment he stepped out of the motor pool, he ceased being Corporal Vance, U.S. Army. He became an unauthorized operative, a ghost operating on borrowed time and stolen courage. And if the mission failed, he vowed, they wouldn't find a corporal, they would find a man who had dismantled the entire chain of command with nothing but a wrench and a rifle. Vance secured the final knot on his pack, the nylon tightening like a noose. The psychological burden was heavy, But paradoxically, the absolute certainty of his fate made the path forward clear. He wasn't burdened by choices anymore. He was burdened only by execution. The insubordination was the necessary calculus, one life, his 4, possibly 30. This was the dark algebra of war. They didn't teach at training camps. He extinguished the cigarette beneath his boot heel. It was dawn. He didn't know what horrors awaited him at the Citadel, but he knew one thing for certain. The greatest danger was now coming from behind him, not in front. He lifted the heavy pack, feeling the familiar strain across his back. Vance understood the Pentagon's perspective perfectly. Order must be maintained, even at the cost of tactical victory. But he had seen the cost of maintaining order when common sense screamed for deviation. The rigid structure of the military was designed to save the body of the army, sometimes by sacrificing its heart. He, the rookie, the grease-trap corporal, was simply refusing to allow the heart to stop beating. He opened the bay door, letting the cool night air wash over the stink of oil and fear. He knew the difference between being a good soldier and being a necessary weapon, and he had chosen the latter. Damn the consequences. Vance's plan was built on omission, a beautiful, brutal economy of motion, where the official protocols demanded 17 steps, 4 signatures, and a dedicated satellite uplink to move a single squad of armored personnel. Vance's scheme required 3 things: audacity, a specific, neglected piece of hardware, and the profound, comforting darkness of a bureaucracy that could never imagine action without authorization. The irony was suffocating. Thousands of man-hours had been poured into predictive algorithms meant to optimize this conflict, yet the solution lay not in complex matrices, but in recognizing a truth so simple it was insulting. The enemy was predictable only when they thought the official protocols were being followed. The official response had metastasized into an organizational tumor. Generals analyzed data streams showing the besieged unit's position, confirming their dire status in triplicate, while waiting for authorization layers that stretched from the forward operating base to the distant air-conditioned halls of the Citadel. The failure wasn't in capability, it was in velocity. They were fastidious accountants auditing a funeral. Vance, however, wasn't dealing with reports. He was dealing with friction. His minimalist strategy bypassed the entire logistics tail, not by fighting it, but by utterly ignoring its existence. He carried only what he could personally account for, stripped down to bare essentials. The crucial insight was seeing the operation not as a rescue mission, but as a high-speed break-in. The neglected hardware was a repurposed, pre-conflict atmospheric monitor, long deemed obsolete, which possessed a unique, unintended capability. It could generate localized spectrum interference that mimicked the signature of a severe weather anomaly, precisely masking his movement from high-altitude surveillance for critical 30-minute bursts. Command had discounted the device years ago, deeming its output too noisy for clean data acquisition. Its complexity was a benefit here. Vance, the grease-trap corporal, had learned to love the noise. This was the genius of his low station. He worked in the discarded corners of the Army's machine, where old technology was just waiting to be taught new, subversive tricks. The official protocols insisted on utilizing the designated supply routes, a network of chalked-off arteries the enemy knew intimately, forcing resource-heavy armored convoys that became prime targets. Vance's route, sketched hastily on a scavenged topographic map from the 1970s, plunged directly through the old toxic industrial zone, a labyrinth of crumbling pipes and chemically volatile runoff. Everyone, official and enemy alike, avoided due to the documented risk of sudden, localized ground collapse. It was a suicide shortcut, discounted by every risk model the Citadel possessed, but Vance knew the collapse zones were seasonal, stabilizing precisely during this dry, cold period. His gamble was founded on basic, forgotten field observation, not expansive satellite telemetry. The inherent danger wasn't the chemical risk. It was the inevitable realization that someone had moved without permission. The Citadel's surveillance network was vast, but it prioritized tracking large resource movements and high-value personnel. Vance was a speck of dirt on a gargantuan engine. Yet, the moment the atmospheric monitor was activated, low-level pattern recognition systems, the kind designed to track unauthorized civilian movement, would flag an anomaly. He wasn't on the high command radar yet, but the ground-level drones were starting to twitch. He was a ghost, yes, but ghosts eventually leave footprints in the dust, and those prints had to be accounted for in the grand ledger of order. The disparity in investment was staggering. The stalled official rescue effort had already consumed billions in logistics planning, fuel expenditure, and analytical staffing, producing nothing but refined fear. Vance's scheme had cost him 3 years of accumulated field ration, a stolen power converter, and the career he had just incinerated. The true financial cost of the official failure, however, was in the drain of Maralta's cynical realization among the troops that the safety protocols had become synonymous with paralysis. They weren't just failing to save 30 lives, they were systematically devaluing them in favor of procedural purity. The trapped unit wasn't just pinned down by enemy fire. They were suffering from a ticking biological clock. The environmental system in their bunker was failing, scheduled to reach critical, unbreathable pressure within 36 hours of factor. The Citadel considered secondary to the tactical problem of extraction. Vance had intercepted a cryptic enemy communication weeks ago, dismissed by analysts as noise, suggesting the hostile forces planned a psychological tactic, not a full frontal assault, but simply waiting for the unit to asphyxiate during a local religious festival known for its enforced silence and lack of external movement. The enemy understood human psychology better than the Citadel's predictive models. The simplicity of salvation warred against the complexity of authorization. Vance carried the immediate weight of 30 lives. The Citadel carried the weight of institutional precedent. He realized the structural weakness wasn't malice, but a terror of accountability. If the official rescue failed, it was a tragedy of circumstance. If Vance's insubordinate plan succeeded, it exposed the bureaucracy as criminally inept. If it failed, Vance provided the perfect scapegoat, a statistical anomaly to be surgically removed, allowing the system to sanitize itself. The command structure wasn't hoping for his success, they were relying on his failure to restore equilibrium. He pressed the activation stud on the atmospheric monitor, feeling the low thrum of the repurposed core against his ribs. It wasn't just generating interference. It was precisely spoofing the spectral signature of the heaviest enemy communication node nearby, making the system essentially argue with itself. It was the digital equivalent of hiding a diamond by placing it next to a mountain of coal. Every step now was committed. The pressure of execution was a physical weight, heavier than his pack. He knew the enemy was currently scanning the official approach vectors, readying their heavy artillery. They wouldn't even think to check the dying heart of the industrial zone. The silence was profound, broken only by the scrape of his heavy boots on the rubble. It was the silence of bureaucratic non-existence, the sound of being off-grid in a world utterly dependent on connection. The vast, empty space where the high command operated was filled with the noise of meetings and projections. Vance was in the cramped, smelly urgency of the real conflict. He checked the status indicator on the monitor. Green, he was cloaked. Then a flicker. Not a catastrophic failure, but a tiny, unavoidable hiccup, a faint data ping that confirmed his trajectory had been registered not by a general, but by an automated sanitation drone. The drone, programmed only to report unauthorized accumulation of debris, registered him as an unspecified moving organic mass entering the restricted collapse zone. It wouldn't raise an alarm, but the data would be logged, filed in the forgotten archives of the sanitation subdivision far beneath the tactical layer. The simplicity of his plan was now battling the unexpected complexity of municipal infrastructure. Vance pushed the thought aside. He had perhaps 20 minutes of effective camouflage before the local enemy spotters, realizing the main routes were quiet, started scanning the peripheries. He lifted his rifle, the cold metal a welcome anchor. The distance to the bunker was agonizingly short, yet miles away. He had chosen the necessary path, and now the clock was not ticking down to defeat, but counting up the cost of salvation. Vance moved. It wasn't a sprint, it was a pressurized glide, a low combat shuffle that ate up the dead ground between the derelict factories and the general's reinforced perimeter. Every muscle fiber screamed against the inherent stupidity of the mission. Unauthorized suicide. He was running on borrowed time, not just from the clock, but from the realization that he had just forfeited his entire future for one impossible shot at redemption. The Combs remained silent, a heavier weight than the rifle. He had sealed off the tactical channel hours ago, meaning no backup, no warnings, and critically, no last-minute veto. The only sound was the grit beneath his boots, muffled by the cloak's field, but still loud enough to feel like a thunderclap in the oppressive silence. He tightened his grip on the rifle stock, confirming the safety was off. He didn't just cross the line, he burned the bridge behind him. The rifle wasn't his standard issue. It was a decommissioned prototype from a black site. 0 serial number, 0 traceability, a ghost weapon that guaranteed if he was caught, the Federation would never acknowledge knowing his name.